All my life I've sort of collected stuff, and because I've moved around so much in my life, each time I moved I'd stash stuff that I'd collected somewhere. About 15 years ago, I thought to myself, gee, I should pull all this stuff together. And I had it in a shed in my backyard when I was living in Northcote. And to my horror one day I realised that the roof of the shed had a hole in it. And every time it rained there was water coming in, and I lost a fair bit of stuff in this collection. At that time I had been giving guest lectures at Melbourne University for the head of the history department, Professor Pat Grimshaw. Pat Grimshaw was a woman historian who I knew had a significant struggle in being accepted and acknowledged in the male-dominated history department when she studied, when she was young. And so I thought, I'll go and see Pat. And I went and saw Pat, and I said, look, I've got a pile of material here that I just need somewhere safe to store it in the interim. And I said, you know, there's got to be a room somewhere in the history department or in this university where I can just leave this stuff, and I said I'd be happy to collate and index the whole collection and make it available as a student resource, you know, in the long term. And Pat Grimshaw looked at me and she said, I'm sorry, we can't help you. And I was a bit perplexed. I said, why not? And she said these words. She said, because you don't have formal academic qualifications. Normally I would have, you know, hit the roof over such a thing being said to me.
Don't do anything.
Look, I don't need any advice from you. You think that my language is obscene.
We're not asking.
I think that what is going on in the black communities in this country is obscene. I find very, very, very offensive the fact that a black person in Burke, if he sets 1 foot in a bloody power bear, he will get his head kicked in. That is extremely offensive to me. I find very offensive the highest infant mortality rate in the world in this country amongst black kids.
I looked at Pat and I said, well, okay, I'll come and get you formal academic qualifications, you know. I took it as a challenge, and for the first time in the 30 years since I'd been expelled from school, I thought, I can do this. All of the history that's taught in high schools, what little there is of it, is a false history, you know, a sanitised version of the struggle of Aboriginal people. In fact, most of the students who end up in my class after leaving school know virtually nothing, not only about Aboriginal struggle, they know nothing about Australian history.
Most of the Australian education systems in this country maintain and perpetuate, even today, a lot of the myths and stereotypes and misconceptions about Aboriginal people. We've got to realise that even young Aboriginal kids grow up with these misconceptions and stereotypes in their own mind as well. When I went to school, the only thing that was taught about Aboriginal people in the classroom when I was there was that they quoted the Dirk Hartog, I think it was, or Dampier quote about Aborigines being the most wretched people on earth, and that the Tasmanian Aborigines had died out, that many Aborigines today just sat around on reserves receiving handouts and drinking and things like that. Now that had an effect on me and twisted my thinking for a while too, until I reached a certain age where I was able to analyse and think and sort of learn about political situations in other parts of the world and put it all in context and realise that it wasn't a question of us being a bunch of lazy drunks sitting around on SS, that what we're dealing with here is a situation of oppression.
The only subject I failed was history. And I failed history because the history that was being taught then had about stuff that had nothing to do with me. It was the history of the British Empire and all this sort of stuff. But it was also taught in a really boring sort of way, which turned all of us students off. Pat Grimshaw saying that to me awoke within me the belief that I can do this. And so I signed up as a first-year undergraduate student at the age of almost 50. And one of the great things in my first semester as a student, undergrad student, was I wound up in Pat Grimshaw's class, the very class that I'd given guest lectures in for all that time. And when Pat came into the first class that semester and saw me sitting there, she freaked out. And
it was Maxfield, the high school, that's the high school number.
eventually I came to Victoria University, and I managed to talk Victoria University, or my boss Karen Jackson, into making a space available on the St Albans campus. Managed to get a $1 million Australian Research Council grant in order to catalogue, index, digitise and create an online educational resource, which is ultimately what all of this is going to be in the long run. And Victoria University gave us this space, which we've had 4 or 5 archivists out here working on cataloguing, indexing and preparing for digitisation. We've got the involvement of about 6 or 7 universities, both here and internationally. Exeter University in England, University in New Zealand, where Linda Tuhai Smith is, John Maynard at the University of Newcastle, and we've got an association with Melbourne Uni with their archivist and digitisation program person over there, Gavin McCarthy. Some of the project partners in the Aboriginal History Archive are Associate Professor Gavin McCarthy, Professor Nikos Papastadiadis from the University of Melbourne, Professor John Maynard, Professor Victoria Haskins, the University of Newcastle. From Deakin University we have Professor John Altman and Associate Professor Melinda Hinkson. From the University of Technology Sydney, Professor Larissa Brent. From the University of Exeter in England, Dr. Andrew Shapp, Professor Graham Smith and Professor Linda Tuhoi Smith from the University of Waikato in New Zealand. Also from other institutions, we have Margot Neal from the National Museum of Australia and Libby Stewart from the Museum of Australian Democracy in Old Parliament House in Canberra. And then you find little bits of paper like this in the collection that change what you thought was the timing of certain things, you know. There's a letter to the organiser of the KKK in Australia. Puerile, irrational and simplistic propaganda. For the first time I was able to actually put and store somewhere all of the collection in a safe and secure place where it wasn't being rained on, and where we could begin the process of going through and cataloguing an index and what was there. Once the whole collection was assembled, I was pretty amazed at what in fact was in it. I still don't know what's in the majority of the collection. I haven't really looked through the inventory that's been created here yet, but I'm hoping that a few of the army of Aboriginal people who are now going to university these days to become interested in history and consider becoming historians as a career, you know. And so for those future potential Aboriginal historians, this material here will enable them to rewrite the current existing versions of Australian history of this period.